What does it mean to trust someone? Well, most simply, it presumably means they won't lie to you, won't betray you, and will be who they say they are. Is it the same with institutions, businesses, and organizations? Well, there's an annual survey that studies how we as citizens feel about the various institutions which affect the quality of our lives. It's called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and the numbers for its 14th annual Trust and Credibility Survey are in. To present the results, we welcome in New York, New York, Richard Edelman, the creator of the barometer and the president and CEO of Edelman. In Vancouver, British Columbia, John Clinton. He's the CEO of Edelman Canada. And then to help us understand the implications of these results, we welcome here in our studio the former MP Martha Hall Findlay, now Executive Fellow at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, and Chris MacDonald, Director of the Jim Pattison Ethical Leadership Program at Ryerson University. And it's great to have you back here, Martha, you for the first time, Chris, and our two guests from out of town. Great to have you with us as well. Let's present the numbers first, Richard, then get you to comment on them if we can. These are the most and least trusted institutions in the year 2014. Non-governmental organizations come out on the top of the charts at 64%. That's up 1 from last year. Business is next at 58%. That's the same as last year. Media, shockingly, 52%. Although that's down 5 points from last year. And government comes in last at 44%, and that's down 4% from last year. Now, Richard, as we suggested, you've been doing these numbers for 14 years, so put the numbers that we've just seen there, if you would, into some kind of historical perspective.
Well, NGOs have always been on the top for the last 14 years, and they continue to rise in importance, particularly in Asia Pacific. At one point, government was the second-rated institution, and it's gone from second to fourth over the period of time. Business has risen, actually, from almost a tie with media at the bottom to be the clear second place finisher, with media in third. Over the period, what we've observed is a quite cyclical kind of movement, particularly for business. Big drops in 2002 and again in 2008, 2009. And in the last 5 years, business has had a quite straight recovery, but that peace dividend has kind of run out of steam this year.
So much to take apart here, but John, let me try this follow-up with you. We're 40 years removed from Watergate right now. So why would government have taken a particular drop in this past year relative to other years?
I think you've seen big issues around the globe with government performance. I think in Canada, you've had a lot of scandals, so that those scandals have caused issues in credibility, issues in trust, issues in believability, and it's reflected in the numbers.
Okay, once again, we're going to look at these same 4 institutions, government, media, business, and NGOs, and we're going to rank them as you do here by country. Whom do you trust in terms of countries? Let's bring this list up here. What would you imagine is number 1? Can you believe this? China? They have 79% of the people have trust in the institutions of China. Second place, Indonesia at 72%. India comes third at 69%. Germany at 57%. The United Kingdom at 52%. Sweden at 51%, the United States now at 49%, France at 46%, Poland just 35%. Where do you think Canada ranks in this scale? Take a guess, everybody. Well, as you might expect, Canadians are sort of in the middle. Canada comes in at 60%, 60% of the people saying that they trust government, media, business, and NGOs, relatively speaking. Okay, Richard Edelman, do you want to sort of put those numbers into perspective for us? China at the top and France and the U.S. closer to the bottom. How does that make sense?
Well, actually, if you look at the world in the 27 countries, more or less, you've got about 9 countries that are the optimistic ones, about 9 that are sort of in the middle, and about 9 that are pessimistic. And interestingly, Canada falls in the optimistic group. And that's been so for the last couple of years, whereas the United States has oscillated between the kind of neutral and pessimist for the last 5 years. And the U.S. this year is back down in the pessimist category because of a profound drop in trust in government of 16 points in this year alone. So Canada hasn't had any big, impasses with its government. It hasn't had any big banking scandals. It's been pretty much steady as you go. And actually Canada, over a period of the 5 years, has risen in the ranks into what we call the blue states or the optimistic group. And that's actually important because it groups Canada with China, India, the fast developing countries, as optimistic about its institutions.
Okay, I take that, but John, help me understand this. How is it possible that China, an authoritarian dictatorship, 79% of the people who live there have trust in their public institutions, whereas in Canada, a reasonably civilized parliamentary democracy, we only have 60% of the people who believe that? Help me figure that out.
What we see in China is that there is a belief in the greater good, and that there is the government is maybe doing some things that aren't that popular or maybe not be seen well on the world stage, but by and large they're doing things that are in the best interest of people throughout the world. In Canada, I think we're a little less trusting than that. We believe that there may be self-interest, there are other negatives going on. That said, as Richard said, we are relatively a nation of trusters.
We're relatively a nation of trusters. Okay. I'm tempted to bring Martha Hall Finley in.
Endorsement there.
Well, I'm tempted to bring you in at this point, and given your experience as a former parliamentarian, how did you feel we relatively did or didn't trust the political institutions that you used to represent?
I have to say, as a former politician, the numbers are a bit distressing. I'll talk, and when we get around in a minute, I think there's some really interesting positives about business, in fact, taking on some of that trust that maybe is lacking in public institutions. But I don't think in Canada we can escape all of the news that comes from the United States. And so we see American politicians spending far more time fighting their partisan fights. And to John's point, unlike a place like China, where there may be a sense among the population that at least government, they may not like what they're doing, they may not necessarily like the system, but they at least have a sense that government is trying to get something done. When you're engaged in these partisan fights and you end up with stalemate after stalemate, it's pretty clear that the politicians in the United States are more focused on what they're doing as opposed to moving the country forward. And in Canada we've had omnibus bills, the problems with omnibus bills in the past. We've had problems with lack of information. And don't forget, in 2011 the government fell, in fact, because it had been found in contempt of Parliament for the first time in our history. What is actually interesting to me is that we still have a relatively high score, notwithstanding those things. And I do think that part of it is the spillover from the Americans.
In which case, Richard Edelman, what makes for the public holding trust in these various institutions?
I think it's some aspect of competence, also of economic performance. You'll see a complete correlation between high trust scores and well-performing economies. Germany has come up 25 points in the last 5 years because their economy is on fire. So Canada's not on fire, but Canada's actually performed pretty darn well and consistently. That word consistent is important. And also, Canada hasn't had vast scandals like the bankruptcy of GM or the bankruptcy of Citibank or the $13 billion fine against JP Morgan last year for mortgage violations. So, the absence of scandal somehow conveys more confidence and trust.
Gotcha. Okay, John Clinton, these results were gleaned because you surveyed what you call, quote unquote, an informed public, which is meant, I gather, to distinguish it from, quote unquote, the general public. So maybe you could help us understand what the difference there is.
Yeah, we measured two publics. The informed public would be slightly better educated, would be higher income earners, would be more media literate relative to the general public. I think the most surprising thing that we see year after year after year is the general public is much more negative in most countries in the world, and definitely in Canada, than the informed public. The informed public, we see, gives people a little more benefit of the doubt than the general public, almost as though the general public's reading the headline, making up their mind, and going with that decision.
Well, in fact, we have some numbers that reflect that which you just said right now. Let's bring these up if we can, Sheldon. Here are several countries around the world surveyed, both in terms of an informed public and then a general public. And if we go to China, we do see the pattern developing that John just referred to. China, 79% of the informed public has trust, whereas the general public, only 67%. In Indonesia, 72 and 62, off 10 points. In Canada, we talked about 60% of the informed public Having confidence, only 54% of the general public, a difference of 6. Australia, 58 and 44. In Germany, 57 and 44, a 13-point difference there. In Sweden, 51 and 38. Only 38% of Swedes, the general public in Sweden, has trust in those institutions. Interesting. And in France, 46 and 33, again a gap of 13 points. So apparently, Richard Edelman, the more you know, the more you trust. Fair to say?
Well, I think that the informed elites are also doing better. I think their economic status is just higher. And if you look at some of the Western European countries, those scores are bad for the general populace because of terribly low trust in government. In fact, in Italy, Spain, France, we're talking about trust in government in the teens. So watch for the rise of the far right in the European parliamentary elections this summer.
As you look at these numbers, Chris, what leaps off the page at you?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is the difference between the feeling of trust and behavioral trust, or the way you actually put that feeling into action. And clearly, a study of this sort is provocative, but what it's mostly getting at is that feeling of trust. And I think the interesting question is, how do people put that into behavior? Because as we've already mentioned, trust is fundamental to the world of business. So, for example, you know, whatever Canadians think about the banking industry, nearly 100% of us trust the banks with our money. People demonstrate trust in a million different ways daily in their business transactions. So I think what's going to be interesting to see is whether the dip in political trust has an effect on things like political engagement, like voting patterns, like civic engagement, like going to town halls.
I notice as well, Martha, that apparently we're not only better than the Americans at hockey, but also in trusting our institutions as well. Did you feel that when you were in Ottawa? Not the hockey part, the other part.
But I think, the comments about the economic stability are extremely valid. There's no question that when Canada weathered the crisis over the last few years, thanks to a number of reasons. One, earlier governments having been economically quite strong in doing the right things, but also banking regulation that did not allow some of the extensions that we saw of risk that we saw in the United States. That economic stability and that comfort for sure made a difference. But it's hard when you're on that side. It's hard when you're in office to really have a sense of what people are saying, because you do read the headlines, you do engage with informed public, you do engage not nearly enough, unfortunately, but with the general public as have been split out for the purposes of the survey. It is actually very hard to tell, and we would love to have the sense that there was a greater sense of confidence. And yeah, as a Canadian, you take a little bit of comfort that we're in better shape than the Americans. But given everything that the Americans have been through, the economic, the crisis, overall challenges economically for different layers of the populace. But as I was mentioning before, just the fiasco in terms of American politics, not being able to get anything done. I'm actually surprised that the numbers aren't even greater. The differences aren't even greater.
I wanted to ask Richard that because, Richard, I know you have to leave us early, so let me ask you one final question, and this would be it. If you watched American cable television, you would be surprised to find, never mind that your numbers of American confidence are whatever they are, 45, 50%, you'd be surprised that they were 2%, because everything seems to be hell in a handcart. So do you find some optimism in these low American numbers, lower than you might want them to be?
Well, let me give you the tough news first, which is that the standing of institutions is actually far higher than the standing of the reputation of its leaders. It used to be the other way around. A CEO or a government leader would actually enhance the visibility and trust in an institution. Well, now it's just the opposite. You know, in Canada, for example, trust in a CEO or a government leader to tell the truth in a complex situation is under 10%. A CEO trusted in Canada is only 33%. Those are terribly low numbers. And the problem is that it's perceived that leaders aren't exactly straight about problems, that they are kind of letting partial truths out. And I think the big recommendation here for those in power is say you have a problem, say what the path forward is, and give people measurable, transparent means of evaluating your progress. Because this kind of, sort of truth isn't working.
It feels, though, Richard, as if these numbers are inexorably going to go down for not only the foreseeable future, but for the long-term future as well. How, do you see a future, and if you do, how many years down the road would it be, where these numbers might start to come up again?
Well, actually, I see optimism in the numbers in the sense that, you know, you've got very high scores for industries like technology, automotive, even in Canada, the banks, 60+%. And these industries are delivering on a better product, fair price, reliable, improving, and good employers. And that's the roadmap. You know, I think that business now has to take the leadership role in setting a context for change. I think that government is unwilling or unable, and this may be a little revolutionary, but I think it's time for CEOs to get on the bully pulpit, engage their employees, talk to NGOs, get a mass movement going. You know, whether the issue is fracking, whether the issue is privacy or cloud computing, you know, it's up to business to make that sale in the public context. It can't be done by government anymore only. And we will follow up on that, but we shall sadly do it in your absence because we know you got to go. Richard Edelman, the president and CEO of the eponymous firm that you lead, thank you for joining us on the line from New York City today. Let's go to, in fact, let's do that right now, shall we? Let's go to, Sheldon, I'm on the bottom of page 4 here. This is the whole business versus government dynamic that Richard Edelman just referred to. And we're going to look at two sets of numbers here, first from 2009 and then from 2014 to see how things have changed, if at all. Business trust, 47% versus government 50% in the year 2009. And then go to 2014, which in the scope of history is not that much later. And business has jumped to 62% trust, where government essentially has stayed the same at 51% trust. And again, let's get into this here. Chris, what do you think accounts for the fact that there seems to be so much more trust in business nowadays, despite the fact we've come out of a great recession largely led by a lot of irresponsible decisions by business, and yet government seems to be static?
Right. Well, I think there are a couple of things. One is that, you know, for practical purposes, as I already suggested, most of us have to trust business on a daily basis, whereas we kind of have the luxury of disengaging emotionally from political leaders. I think people are probably seeing, to a certain extent, seeing through you know, the scandals. And that, I mean, I think the scandals tell us a bit about why people don't trust CEOs so much. But the fact that life has generally stayed reasonably good for a whole bunch of people, and as Richard and John mentioned, especially for people who are in that informed public, life has stayed okay, and so it seems safe to keep trusting.
They do make a distinction between the CEO and business in general.
Yeah,
there is a big difference there.
And I think that's fair. If I were CEO of a bank, I'd be much more concerned that the public trust my tellers than that they trust me, frankly.
John, how about you? What do you think business seems to be significantly ahead of government in terms of whom we trust more?
Well, interestingly, it's not. Government has not stayed low. Government rose basically in tandem with business until this year, and then fell off quite dramatically. So to look at it in the over the 5-year period, it really ended up in a different place. But they were matching for 4 of the 5 years. I think this year you have seen business outperform government, as it were. I think the scandal, while it tends to have been personality driven in Canada, has made an impact and has had an impact. I think the government has fallen under a lot of criticism for lack of transparency, lack of ease of dealing with, not dealing with issues. And so I think that's really had a big impact.
Martha Hall-Finley, I'm going to ask you, you've got 3 hats on today, if you like. You're a former politician, you've got this new position at the University of Calgary, but you also work in the private sector today. What do you do?
I do. I am the Chief Legal Officer for a joint venture among Rogers, Bell and TELUS for mobile payments.
What's that called?
It's called Endstream.
Endstream?
Yes.
Okay, so you've got some tentacles into the private sector as well.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you'd follow up on Richard's comment that he believes a day is coming in the not too distant future where private business is going to have to start to do the things that we traditionally thought government ought to do, but because we don't trust government anymore and we seem to trust business a lot more, maybe we'd prefer they do it. What do you think that is?
I'm just sad that he's not still with us, because I wanted to chime in and say I couldn't agree more. I think what he said was absolutely bang on. And to, you know, true confessions, I have been in business for a lot longer than I was in politics, and so I bring wearing a business hat perhaps more comfortably sometimes.
You were the coat is the right color. You were a pretty blue grit, if I recall.
but very interested in the results of this work and in Richard's comments, because not only do I think that it's time for business and there's an opportunity for business to take on some of these challenges, I would argue that in Canada that's already happened. And so if you look at some of the major progress. Now, we hear headlines about challenges with Aboriginal communities and pipelines and energy, but we've made major progress with a whole lot of Aboriginal communities in terms of economic participation. That has been led by the private sector. So if you, instead of having this battle that we've seen government to Aboriginal groups, aside from the recent announcement on education, which kudos is terrific, but historically we've had challenges, right? But the employment levels of Aboriginals in the oil sands, for example, are terrific. There's a tremendous level of economic participation. You have private interests negotiating with Aboriginal communities as we speak in terms of use of land, in terms of participating from an economic perspective. Government right now just doesn't have the credibility, but a lot of businesses do. So that's already happening. And my view is that there's a real opportunity for there to be even more of that. And it's not because businesses are sensing that, well, if we don't do this, we're not going to make a profit. I have a very strong sense that there are an awful lot of people in business who understand that doing the right thing for these communities or doing the right thing environmentally is not something that's mutually exclusive from profits. It's that there are an awful lot of business people who understand that not only are they not mutually exclusive, they are actually mutually beneficial.
You can do well by doing good.
You can do well by doing good, if that's grammatically correct, but you said it first, so there you go. But yes, so I was really quite thrilled to hear Richard say that, because I couldn't agree more.
John, I wonder if you could add to that insofar as maybe put a few more things on the checklist of what you see business doing in future that we may traditionally have thought of as being in the government's realm.
Well, it's interesting. I think what this study is telling us is nobody can go it alone. You know, you've got NGOs with a ton of trust, but they need money, they need resource, they need help. You've got business with a lot of capability, but they're having leadership issues. So they need to be able to partner with NGOs. They need to be able to partner with government. And I think that's what this is really saying, that there's a real opportunity for business in particular and CEOs in particular to become chief engagement officers and engage those publics to work together to get stuff done. It's about good business being good for business. And that's the key thing that needs to be pushed here.
Forgive my ignorance here, but is that a real job, what you just said, the chief engagement officer?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is 14 years ago, a CEO could stand to be by herself or himself and do things more under the cone of silence and get away with it. That was expected. I think nowadays, I mean, the most trusted person in an organization isn't the CEO, it's a regular employee. And people have access to regular employees. You have access to any kind of information you want from any source. So I think CEOs in particular need to learn how to engage these people, need to learn how to engage academic experts, need to learn how to engage government, and develop a path forward for business that solves not only the business issues, but some of the societal issues that affect business.
Chris, there is a paradox in some of the numbers, though, and I want to put it to you, and I hope you will have an explanation that will help us out here. At the same time as Canadians say they trust government much less than they trust business, more than 2/3 of these so-called informed Canadians that we talked about earlier see the government's role as protecting consumers from business. Explain.
I think this goes back to what we've just been talking about in terms of multi-party engagement, right? Because, you know, I think, and I've been on the record before as having said, I think we're actually living in a golden age of business ethics. I think we're seeing companies acting more responsibly, protecting consumers better, protecting the environment better, being more responsible, less discriminatory. But I think that's in part because we've got active NGOs and good government regulation. So I think if trust is going to grow in business, it's in part because of the role that government plays in co-regulation, in regulation, in delegated regulation, in all kinds of partnerships with business and with NGOs in order to pursue the public good.
Well, Martha, do you find that a bit of a conundrum, though, that we say we like business, we trust business more than government, but on the other hand, we really want government to protect us from those folks in business?
But I don't think, I agree with Chris, and I don't think that it's necessarily we trust business to be best for us in terms of, you know, baby products and, you know, whether the paint has lead in it or something. I mean, we have issues with importing. Are we sure that that's been covered? I don't know that the trust is necessarily at that level, and we do expect government to have consumer protection policies, and we rely on those. My sense is that the trust in business that we're talking about here is a larger engagement in the economy of the country, a larger engagement in being involved in expanding our trade opportunities, for example, and a larger looking out for the larger economic health of the country. So you know, it'd be interesting to see that parsed out, but I think they both apply. I think we do rely on government to cover off some of those smaller things, the immediate things in terms of trust, but it's the larger picture that business can play that we seem apparently to have more trust.
And John, I want you to help us understand this part of the equation as well. People know what governments do, they know what businesses do, they know what media do. My hunch is they know less about NGOs, non-governmental organizations, than they do about those other three. And yet Richard Edelman, when he was here, told us that year after year after year, ever since this survey's been around, NGOs come out #1. Why would that be?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think NGOs are seen to be the guys who wear the white hats, and increasingly around the world. I wouldn't say they're not under any pressure, though. I think people, as skepticism grows in all institutions, I think they will fall under the same skepticism as media, as business, and as government. I don't think they're going to have a free ride. I think that's why this partnership notion becomes so critically important. They are going to fall under the same scrutiny about integrity. They're going to fall under the same scrutiny about engagement and ethics. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next few years.
And Chris, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Martha.
No, I was just going to, I think that's actually healthy. Not that you'd ever want to advocate less trust, because trust is an important thing. But over the years, I have had involvement with a number of NGOs, some of which are fantastic.
Who's fantastic?
And some of which are not.
Okay,
and I will refrain from naming names, Steve. No, I will not.
Okay, you don't want to tell us who's awful. Who's fantastic?
I'm just, let's leave it there. All that I think is important is that there should be more skepticism. Not all NGOs are created alike, just like not all businesses are created alike. And I think a healthy dose of skepticism and understanding and transparency is actually very helpful. And then I will just repeat that again speaks to the notion that it's everybody working together that's a real opportunity here.
But apparently, Chris, we have a decent trust in business, certainly more than we do in government, and yet the CEOs, who are the heads of those businesses in which we apparently have a decent amount of trust, they score abysmally. Only 33% of respondents say they trust the CEOs. Mm-hmm. What could CEOs or should CEOs be doing to improve their scores?
Well, I mean, in part, they need to focus on a couple of things. One is they need to differentiate between trust within the organization, which maybe in a sense is job #1, right? Because if they don't have the trust of the people working for them, then there's sort of a real slide there that the people that are working for them aren't going to be able to carry out the mission, and there's going to be incongruities between what they're up to and what employees are up to. I think you know, they need to say what they're going to do and then do what they said they were going to do. I mean, I don't think there's much grand theory here. I think there's simple, homely advice that you need to be a person of your word. You need to tell people where you're headed and tell them how you're going to get there.
I think part of the problem is that CEOs are very rarely in the public eye. And so when they are, they tend to not be there for good reasons.
They tend to be testifying before Congress on how they screwed us over. They tend to be CEOs in the public, and this maybe speaks to John's point that CEOs should be more engaged, because if there are some positive things for them to be engaged in, it will actually encourage more trust. But think of the oil spill in the Gulf, right? The oil well in the Gulf. The CEO's response, not particularly good. BP.
BP. think of Lac Mégantic and the reaction of the CEO there.
Who owned the train company.
The train company. Not a good reaction. Contrast that to what Michael McCain, when we had the listeriosis problem, and his behavior was so positive. And remember, the reaction was so positive. It was almost as if we expected a CEO not to be forthright. We expected a CEO to listen to, you know, in that case, his gang of lawyers. And he came across as so open and honest, and this is what we're going to do, that it really stuck out. I think that's partly because most of the time when CEOs are in the public eye, it's not for good, it's not because they've done something particularly positive.
There are apparently...
Let me say though, there are an awful lot of CEOs who do great work. It's just that the ones who end up in the public eye are there for usually not such great reasons.
John Clinton, there are apparently 5 countries where trust in government is higher than trust in business. We've pointed out in the program so far it's overwhelmingly more trust in business in most countries. But those 5 countries are Singapore, Netherlands, South Korea, the United Arab Emirates, where apparently government and business both score in the 80s, very high, and Sweden. Yep. Is there something about those 5 countries that's different from Canada, US, France, Italy, Germany, I mean all the rest of them, where apparently we trust business more than government?
Trust in government tends to go up as with economic performance. So if a country is doing well, as in the case of Emirates or Singapore, their trust scores would be higher. It's also about belief in the institution. I think you look at a country like Sweden, and there's a very strong belief in the role of government and a very clearly defined role for government. So I think that really helps the trust scores there. And
just, we have a couple of minutes to go here, and we should talk about impact on democracy. And Martha, to that end, is there a connection between the level of trust one has in the government and voter turnout, in your view?
Yes. If you look at countries where you have incredibly high voter turnout, often it's because things are really bad. So the irony there is that you will often get very high voter turnout
to throw the bums out.
To throw the bums out, or because things are so desperate that they need change and will exercise that opportunity to do so. You know, I have heard people say things are pretty good in Canada. The economy's pretty good. You know, we have relative freedom. We have it's a pretty fantastic country, and that sometimes is shown in our voter turnout because you don't have the same level of anger.
So you would see low voter turnout as contentment?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. I'm just pointing out that there are differences in voter turnout for different reasons. Okay. My frustration with the increasingly low voter turnout in Canada is that you do get what you pay for, as it were, and it is important that we have people engage and make those choices. I worry that the sense is it's not so much that it's a lack of trust, notwithstanding these numbers, that there's just a lack of sense of being able to accomplish anything, you know. And for those of us who are working toward, you know, greater levels of proportional representation, here in the Ontario government, it looks like they're going to be putting forward the opportunity for municipalities to do ranked ballots, which it's a form of getting closer to where voters might feel their vote has more of an effect than it otherwise has.
A ranked ballot meaning you can vote for your first choice, second choice,
third choice. And so the person who wins has to get at least 50% in the end. That's not the first past the post system we have federally and provincially. I think that's really interesting. So my sense is it's probably less a sense of lack of trust and more simply a sense that, well, my vote's not going to make much difference.
Chris, as you look at, is there any connection in your mind between how much we trust government and voter turnout?
Oh, I think for at least a certain percentage of people, I think that's the case. I mean, I think trust is a public good, right? I mean, it's one of those things that makes democracies work. You can't have a functioning democracy without a certain level of trust, and just in the same way that you can't have business without a certain level of trust. So I think for a certain percentage of people, we're going to see them disengage if they feel like they don't trust. Well, again, the question then is, don't trust what? Don't trust the civil service, don't trust political leaders at the highest levels, don't trust don't trust the electoral system. Different kinds of trust, or trust in different elements of government, is going to lead to different kinds of engagement or disengagement.
But if you get to the point where you have real lack of trust in your current government, then I'd argue you might actually see greater voter turnout because of wanting to kick the bums out.
John, if trust is a good thing, and I assume we all think that higher levels of trust is a good thing as long as it's properly earned, give us some hints on the best way that added trust can be increased in a society.
We looked at it and divided it up into groupings of attributes. And it's funny, 14 years ago, the #1 sort of attribute grouping was operations. So did you make money? Did you have a good CEO? Did you return money to the shareholders? Did you make good products? All of which are still very important, but funnily, they're table stakes now. The critical thing now is in the area of engagement. Are your employees engaged? Are your customers engaged? Do people feel rewarded? And in the area of integrity, do you tell the truth? Do you do the right thing in a tough situation? Are you paying attention to the issues that need to be dealt with? It's really quite fascinating. None of it, I think, is brain surgery, but it really points to more of a leadership crisis as opposed to an institution crisis.
But John, I'm wondering again if there's a paradox here, because if we're going to find out whether these institutions are performing well vis-a-vis engagement or integrity, chances are we're going to hear about it or see it or read about it in some mainstream media. And our trust levels of them is not great. So is that problematic for business?
Yes, it can be, because more trust, it's funny, in Canada, we're one of the few countries left in the world where traditional media is still the most trusted source of news. So your CBCs, your Globe and Mails, your TVOs are more highly trusted than any other form of media.
Gotcha. That's John Clinton, the CEO of Edelman Canada. He joined us on the line from Vancouver, BC. And thanks also in our studio here today to Martha Hall-Finley, the Executive Fellow at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy, and Chris McDonald, Director of the Jim Pattison Ethical Leadership Program at Ryerson University here in Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.